You don't expect to find a face down here. Not in the dark, not under meters of water, not buried in sand like it was never meant to be seen again. But the diver's flashlight hit the seabed, and suddenly, the shape became unmistakable. Eyes, nose, lips, a carved stone face staring out of silence. And for a second, your brain tries to protect you. It says, coincidence, a statue lost from a ship, a storm dragged it here. Anything but the truth, because the truth is heavier. Then the team checked the scans again, and everything changed. Near that statue, the seabed wasn't random. It was organized. Straight lines, right angles, repeating geometry, patterns that don't happen by accident. And when they widened the search, the anomalies stopped being dots and started connecting like a plan. That's when they realized the statue wasn't the discovery, it was the clue. Because what it led to wasn't one artifact, it was the remains of an underwater city hidden in plain sight beneath the Bay of Aboukir near Alexandria. And here's the proof angle. This isn't a legend dressed up as history. In 2000, underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio and the IEASM documented the rediscovery of the sunken port city known as Thonis in Egyptian and Heracleion in Greek. We're going to do one thing: follow the clue, from a face in the dark to the city that history lost. And the question nobody can ignore: how does an entire city disappear into the sea and stay hidden for centuries? You don't hear the ocean down here, you feel it. The water turns thick and silent, like the world is holding its breath. Your mask fogs at the edges. Your flashlight beam is a thin tunnel, barely enough to carve meaning out of the dark. At first, it's just shapes. A lump of stone, a ridge, a curve that could be anything. Then the beam catches something that makes your stomach drop. A face, not a vague pattern your brain wants to see. An actual carved face. Calm expression, heavy features, and the longer you hold the light there, the more it feels like the face is looking back. You tell yourself, it's just a statue. But that's when you notice the second thing. The face isn't lying in rubble like a broken relic. It's positioned, anchored in the seabed. Like it belongs here. Like this place was built for it. And suddenly the question isn't, what is that? It's, how many more are down here? Because one statue underwater is a mystery. But when statues appear where statues shouldn't be, you start suspecting you're floating over something far bigger than a single object. Something like a city. For centuries, ancient writers hinted at a powerful port at the edge of Egypt, a gateway where ships entered, taxes were paid, and gods were honored. But there was a problem. No one could find it. No standing walls, no obvious ruins on land. Just names and old texts and scattered clues, like the story of a place that existed so loudly it couldn't be erased, and yet was erased anyway. And that's the thing about the sea. It doesn't just bury, it rewrites. The shoreline shifts, the delta moves, sediment falls like slow snow. Whole neighborhoods can disappear under mud without drama, without headlines, just quiet, year by year. So when people talked about a lost city, it sounded like legend, until technology and obsession teamed up. Because there are archaeologists who don't wait for ruins to stand above ground. They chase the places that collapsed into the water and stayed there, sealed under silt like a time capsule. And somewhere in the Bay of Aboukir, not far from Alexandria, the sea had been guarding an answer. Not a single temple, not a single statue, but a drowned landscape, streets of stone, sanctuaries, harbors, an entire port city that once controlled the mouth of Egypt, a place with two names, Thonis in Egyptian, Heracleion in Greek. Frank Gaudio wasn't chasing treasure. He was chasing coordinates, history you could prove with stone and inscriptions. His team at the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology searched the Nile Delta region with the stubborn belief that if the city existed, it left something behind. This isn't the romantic version of archaeology. It's cold water, low visibility, heavy gear, long hours scanning mud that looks like nothing, and technology that turns empty ocean into a map of anomalies, shapes that don't belong. You scan, you flag, you return, you dredge carefully, you measure, and most days you find nothing you can put in a thumbnail until you find the day you do. In 2000, the search changes from maybe to there it is, because beneath the silt, the team starts seeing a pattern, structures, blocks, architectural fragments, and then the kind of objects that don't drift into place by accident: monumental statuary, religious artifacts, inscriptions, the type of evidence that doesn't whisper, it announces. The lost city wasn't a metaphor. It was sitting under the Bay of Aboukir the whole time, waiting for the right eyes and the right tools to notice it again. Anyone can tell a story. Archaeology has to prove it, and proof doesn't look like a myth. It looks like something you can measure, photograph, translate, a carved stone, a stela, an inscription that says, this place had a name, this place had laws, this place had power. That's what makes Thonis Heracleion hit so hard. Before its rediscovery, the city was mostly preserved in ancient writings and rare inscriptions found elsewhere. But underwater, the city begins to hand over receipts, not just pretty artifacts, administrative details that scream real world, commerce, taxes, temple economies, international traffic. And then comes the most haunting part. Many objects aren't scattered like storm debris. They're positioned as if the city fell while still alive. Temples, harbors, sacred spaces, frozen in a collapse the sea never finished cleaning up. This is where your brain starts racing. If this was a major port, why did it vanish? If it was powerful, why didn't later generations rebuild it? If it sank, what kind of disaster can swallow a city? And the deeper you go, the more the sea answers with more questions. Now we return to the image that hooks people emotionally, a face in the dark. Because Thonis Heracleion isn't just foundations and fragments. Divers documented massive statues underwater, figures that feel almost impossible to move even on land. And some of them were found in the gloom like guardians that never got the message the city was gone. Imagine this from a diver's view. Your light sweeps across the seafloor, and the sand rises into a human shape. Not a modern human, an ancient one carved in stone, expression calm, posture ceremonial. And you can't help thinking the same thought every viewer thinks. If I saw that down there, I would panic. But then the documentary brain kicks in. These statues tell you what kind of city this was. Big public monuments mean wealth, organization, a religion deeply tied to the state, a harbor important enough to display power to anyone arriving by ship. This wasn't a hidden village. This was a front door to Egypt. And when a front door sinks into the sea, you don't just lose buildings. You lose a whole chapter of how the world connected. So now the hook evolves. A statue isn't the discovery. A statue is the clue. Because if there are faces down here, placed like they belonged, then the real question is, what else is laid out in the dark around them? And when the scans show straight lines, right angles, repeated geometry, you start realizing you're not looking at debris. You're looking at the remains of planning. You're looking at a city. So what was this place really? Thonis Heracleion functioned as a major port, one of the key entry points into Egypt through the Delta. That means paperwork, taxes, inspections, warehouses, sacred rituals tied to commerce. Because in ancient Egypt, religion and economy weren't separate worlds. They were braided. A port city like this isn't just boats. It's foreign merchants, translators, guards, priests, dock workers, officials collecting fees, and the constant movement of goods. And if you want to feel the scale, picture the city in motion, ropes tightening on wooden ships, crews shouting, cargo shifting, the smell of river water mixing with salt, officials watching every arrival, a temple looming beyond the docks like a warning and a welcome at the same time. Because in a place like this, arriving isn't casual. Entering Egypt is an event. And that's what makes the underwater ruins feel so heartbreaking. When you see stone blocks and broken monuments in the silt, you're not just seeing what's left. You're seeing what stopped. Now here's the wild part. One of the strongest clues underwater isn't even a temple. It's the ships. The seabed around the site holds an extraordinary concentration of ancient vessels. So many that the place feels like a ship graveyard. And ships don't gather in one place unless that place was a major harbor, a choke point for traffic, a disaster zone, or all three. Some ships may have sunk during storms. Some may have been trapped by collapsing structures. Some may have been abandoned as the city declined. Each wreck is a timestamp. Each wreck is evidence that the water didn't swallow a myth, it swallowed an economy. And when your mind hears ship graveyard, it instantly creates new questions. What did these ships carry? Who owned them? How did so many end up here? Perfect. That's the kind of question that keeps someone watching. Thonis Heracleion wasn't alone. The research around this region also connects to another submerged city nearby, Canopus. Now the story expands from a lost city to a lost coastline. And that changes everything, because if multiple cities sank, this wasn't one isolated accident. This was a regional collapse. So how does something like that happen? People imagine cities sinking like an action film. Reality is slower and scarier. In delta regions, the ground can behave like a trap. Soft sediments, waterlogged layers, shifting channels. Under the wrong conditions, soil can lose strength and behave almost like liquid, especially when heavy stone structures sit on top. That means the city may not have dropped. It may have failed. A temple collapses, crushing what's beside it. A harbor wall gives way. A canal shifts. The sea pushes in farther each generation until one day the city isn't a city. It's a memory. And then the sea does what the sea always does. It covers the evidence and preserves it. Now focus on the temple, because in a port city, the temple isn't just spiritual, it's political. It's where authority is displayed, where contracts are blessed, where foreigners learn what the city worships, and therefore what the city obeys. A temple near the harbor is like a flag planted in stone. This place has power, and it knows it. So when the sacred zone begins to fail, people don't just panic economically, they panic existentially. Because if the city center can collapse, then nothing is safe. Now let's talk about the moment a city stops being a city. Not in a movie scene, not with one perfect date stamped in gold, but with the kind of collapse that feels like the world is slipping, inch by inch, and then all at once. Picture the harbor on a normal day. Ropes creak, wood groans under weight, men shout directions over water. Cargo shifts from ship to dock. Officials watch arrivals the way a lock watches a key. And beyond the docks, the temple stands like a heartbeat, ritual and authority wrapped into stone. Then the first warning signs don't look dramatic. They look wrong. A crack that wasn't there yesterday, a stone that sits a little lower, a wall that leans more than it should. Water pushing into places it never used to reach. In a delta, land can betray you quietly, and then one day, quietly, ends. A section gives way. A platform fractures. A harbor wall fails. The ground doesn't behave like ground anymore. It softens. It slides. It takes weight it can't carry and decides to stop carrying it. Ships slam against each other. Dock lines snap. Water churns where it should be calm. People run, not because they understand the science, but because they understand the feeling. The city is losing its shape. And here's the line that matters. And the sea did not give it back. Because once the sea begins to claim a port, it doesn't stop at the docks. It moves inward. It eats the edges. It floods the canals. It fills the streets. And generation by generation, a living place turns into an underwater memory. Then comes the part history loves to do. It goes silent until the silence breaks. Because in 2000, the story reopens. Not with a myth, but with a method. A team returns to the bay with instruments that can read the seabed. They map anomalies. They follow patterns. They mark positions. They dive. They clear silt carefully. Because underwater archaeology isn't dig fast, it's don't destroy the evidence. And then the moment hits them. It's not one object. It's not one structure. It's a layout, straight lines, right angles, repeated geometry, foundations that speak the language of planning. And suddenly, the dead city speaks again, not with words, but with shape. A statue in the dark wasn't the discovery. It was the clue. When people hear sunken city, they imagine treasure, gold, jewels, pirate chests. But the real treasure in archaeology is information. Coins don't matter because they're shiny. They matter because they tell you who was trading, who was visiting, what era the city was active, and how money moved through the port. Weights don't matter because they're heavy. They matter because they prove commerce, real transactions measured and controlled. Pottery fragments don't matter because they're pretty. They matter because they travel. They carry fingerprints of place, time, and exchange. And underwater, context is everything. A single artifact without context is just an object. But an artifact found where it fell, in a layer that can be studied, beside other objects that share the same story, that becomes evidence. That's why this isn't treasure hunting. Treasure hunting rips objects from the seabed like you're stealing pages out of a book. Archaeology reads the whole page. And once you start reading Thonis Heracleion like a book, the narrative becomes clear. This city wasn't small. This city wasn't isolated. This city was connected, economically, politically, and spiritually, to a wider world. Now here's where real science makes the story even stronger. Because science doesn't just give you a dramatic explanation, it gives you honest boundaries. So let's separate what we can say confidently from what we still debate. We can confidently say the city existed, it was documented underwater, and it produced monumental remains and artifacts consistent with a major port and religious center. We can confidently say the city ended up underwater, But the exact sequence, how much was slow subsidence, how much was sudden disaster, how many separate events stacked over time, that part can be complex. And that's not a weakness. That's how history works when nature doesn't leave a neat diary. So here's the clean way to keep credibility and keep viewers locked in. We know the city is there. We know it mattered. We know it sank. And we know the sea preserved enough for us to reconstruct pieces of its life. What we don't always have is a single dramatic moment we can point to and say, this was the instant. But we don't need that instant to understand the truth, because the seabed itself is the record. Now let's talk about why this matters today. Because this isn't just a spooky underwater story. It's a reminder that permanent is a feeling, not a guarantee. Cities feel permanent when you live in them. Temples feel permanent when they tower over harbors. Trade routes feel permanent when ships arrive every day. And then nature reminds you that coastlines move, ground sinks, water rises, and history can be erased without fire, just by silence and sediment. What the sea did here wasn't only destruction, it was archiving. And that's why underwater ruins feel so powerful. On land, time is loud. Wind, rain, hands, roads, construction. Underwater, time is quiet. Sometimes an artifact survives better under silt than it would on open ground. Sand becomes a blanket. Darkness becomes protection. And the result can feel unsettling, because the face you see down there looks too intact, too calm, too present. That's why statue discoveries are emotional even when you know they're just stone. They don't look dead. They look waiting. And there's another reason the finds are so important. A statue doesn't exist alone. A statue implies ceremony. It implies placement. It implies people arriving and seeing it. It implies authority. So when divers recover colossal statues from the seabed, the city stops being an abstract concept. It becomes physical. You can lift a piece of it, conserve it, display it, measure it, prove it. And that's when the audience feels what archaeologists feel. This wasn't a story someone told. This was a place where people lived, worked, prayed, and watched ships come and go. And then, one day, it didn't. So how does a city literally sink? One of the most terrifying possibilities in soft, waterlogged ground is that the land can lose strength under stress, not in a magic way, in a physical way. When sediments are saturated and unstable, strong shocks, like earthquakes, can make the ground behave like fluid for a period of time. Heavy structures don't just crack. They settle, slide, sink, and collapse as foundations stop acting like solid support. Even without one single catastrophic moment, the delta environment itself can slowly undermine a city. Channels shift, sediment compacts, land subsides, storms push water farther inland, and each event leaves the city weaker than before. The result can be a collapse that happens in chapters. First, the harbor struggles. Then the streets flood more often. Then buildings fail. Then the shoreline retreats. Then the city becomes a memory people argue about, until the memory becomes an underwater map. Now here's something most people don't realize. New discoveries can keep happening at a site like this for years, because the seabed isn't static. Sand moves. Storms uncover pieces, then bury them again. And archaeological work is slow and careful by design. Every excavation is a controlled conversation with the past. Too aggressive, and you destroy context. Too sloppy, and you lose the story. And that leads to one final truth. Not everything is recovered. In underwater heritage, a major principle is preserving sites where they lie whenever possible. Because lifting artifacts out of water is risky. Once an object leaves the sea, it begins changing. Salt, pressure, temperature, everything shifts. Conservation becomes a race against chemistry. And there's protection too. Underwater sites can be damaged by anchors, careless diving, looting, and storms. So sometimes the most responsible choice is to document carefully and leave much of the city resting where it fell, which means the sea is still holding pages we haven't read yet. There's a moment in every real discovery story where everything clicks. At first, it's an object, then it's a site, and then, if the evidence keeps stacking, it becomes something bigger, a city. That moment arrives when the finds stop looking random and start looking organized. Because cities leave patterns. Streets align. Foundations repeat. Monuments sit where arrivals would see them. Sacred zones cluster around ritual routes. Harbors create predictable structures because ships require predictable infrastructure. And once you can map those patterns underwater, you're no longer staring at a statue. You're hovering over a drowned plan. Now let's do the honest part. What probably happened? We know the city ended up underwater. The strongest explanations involve a mix of long-term instability and severe events that accelerated collapse. Subsidence, shifting delta sediments, flooding, storms, and seismic shocks can combine into a slow failure that sometimes includes sudden breaks. And even if the sinking took time, to the people living there, it would still feel like the world was ending. Because each year, the city would lose a little more ground. Now focus again on the temple, because if you want to understand why this city mattered, you don't start with the docks. You start with the sacred center. In a port city like this, the temple isn't only religious, it's a public statement of power. It tells every ship arriving, this is who rules here. It tells locals, this is the center of order. It tells outsiders, you are entering a place that watches you. So when the sacred zone fails, the collapse becomes more than economic. It becomes psychological, because people can survive hard times. But when the heart of the city begins to break, everyone understands the same thing. This isn't a problem we can fix. This is the end. All right, this is where we lock credibility and keep the mystery alive. Here's the cleanest way to tell the truth. We can confirm the city existed, it was documented underwater, and it produced monumental remains consistent with a major port and sacred center. We can confirm it sank beneath the sea, and we can confirm the region holds more than one submerged story, meaning this coastline changed dramatically over time. What stays more complex is the exact sequence of events, how gradual versus how sudden, how many separate collapses happen, which events were the biggest drivers. That uncertainty isn't weakness. That's evidence of a real world that doesn't hand us perfect timelines. And now the ending. The ocean didn't destroy this city the way fire destroys paper. The ocean archived it. It sealed streets under silt. It wrapped statues in darkness. It preserved structures in silence. And every time researchers return with better mapping and better documentation, another piece of the city becomes visible again. So we end where we began, a flashlight, a face, silence, and the realization that history isn't always lost. Sometimes it's just out of sight, waiting for the next beam of light. Now here's the question I want you to answer in the comments, because the answer tells me what we investigate next. Do you think this city vanished slowly, or was it taken in a chain of sudden disasters? If you had to pick one, which do you believe, and why? Because if one city can vanish into the sea and stay hidden until modern technology finds it, the real question is, what else is down there that we haven't even named yet? That's a psychological collapse as much as a physical one. Now we return to the clean truth again, because we don't want exaggeration. We want what can be proved. So we ask, how do archaeologists turn a haunting image into a documented city? How do they prove the difference between a creepy discovery and a real layout? They do it with the method: mapping, grids, measurements, documentation. The boring work that makes the story undeniable. And once you see the method, the mystery becomes more unsettling because it becomes real. A single underwater photo can fool you. A full map is harder to argue with. Underwater archaeology turns the seabed into data. Scans reveal geometry. Divers confirm objects. Measurements lock positions. Photogrammetry records shapes. Grids preserve context. That's how you go from "we found a statue" to "we have a city layout." And that changes the audience mindset. Now you're not watching a spooky dive clip, you're watching a case file. And when you feel like you're watching a case file, you want the conclusion. So here's the cleanest way to tell the truth. We can confirm the city existed. It has been documented underwater with monumental remains consistent with a major port and a sacred center. We can confirm it sank beneath the sea. And we can confirm the region holds more than one submerged story, meaning this coastline changed dramatically over time. What stays more complex is the exact sequence of events. How gradual versus how sudden. How many separate collapses happen? Which events were the biggest drivers? That uncertainty isn't weakness. That's evidence of a real world that doesn't hand us perfect timelines. And now the ending. The ocean didn't destroy this city the way fire destroys paper. The ocean archived it. It sealed streets under silt. It wrapped statues in darkness. It preserved structures in silence. And every time researchers return with better mapping and better documentation, another piece of the city becomes visible again. So we end where we began. A flashlight, a face, silence. And the realization that history isn't always lost. Sometimes it's just out of sight, waiting. Now I want your theory in the comments. Do you think Thonis Heracleion vanished slowly over time? Or was it taken by a chain of sudden disasters? And tell me where we should dive next. More Egypt, Japan's underwater ruins, Cambodia, or another mystery you can't stop thinking about. Thank you for diving with us. This is Relic of History, where the past isn't dead. It's waiting. Until the next descent, keep your light ready.